It's a great joy today to welcome Dr. Brad Strawn to be our conversing guest today. Dr. Strawn is on the faculty of Fuller Theological Seminary's School of Psychology. He is also an ordained Nazarene pastor and serves in that role here in Pasadena at Pasadena Nazarene Church. He is a clinical psychologist, so in addition to the work that he does as a professor, he also sees clients regularly and has an ongoing practice that's also part of his life. So the gift of having him today as our guest is that we have a clinical practitioner, a professor of psychology, and a pastor, all rolled up into one person who's going to be the guest for today. So welcome, Brad. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I have great admiration for you, and I think it's partly because there was a period when I was a student at Fuller many years ago when I was debating about whether I wanted to stay in the School of Theology or whether I was going to jump to the School of Psychology. I didn't make that jump, but I have always imagined what that might have been like. And there are several people on the faculty of our psych school who are people that hold this kind of dual way of being. And I really admire the way that I think you have carried that out and the way that you contribute to Fuller academically and pastorally and clinically. So thank you for all of that work.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I think today, because we all know that almost every day there are headlines actually about mental health issues in America, let's just start with something super basic. Why don't you just describe what mental health even is?
That sounds like a really easy question, doesn't it?
And it's just really not. Yeah, I understand.
It's really easy. Well, of course, I mean, I think I'm explicitly or specifically reminded today that, how we describe mental health is, of course, actually a very social located question that has to do with culture and ethnicity and race and gender and sexual orientation and all those kinds of things. And when we talk about mental health, there's both what do we mean by someone maybe being healthy in their mental capacities, but also things like accessibility to mental health, which again is another social location kind of question.
Right.
But when, if we were to talk about what comes to my mind, and I think in the mind of some of the literature at least, in terms of what does it mean to be a healthy person, there are a number of things immediately come to mind. One of those is a person's capacity to have relationships with other people that are mutually, that are reciprocal, that are mutual, that are life-giving, that allow a person to thrive and flourish in their particular social location. So it doesn't always look the same, but there's some sense of relatedness that brings joy, flourishing, thriving, reciprocity. And I think along with that has to do with a couple important issues which are in the realm of emotion. So how do people manage their emotion? Can we regulate our emotion as people, or do we feel overwhelmed by our emotion, which leads to things like anxiety and depression, for example? And then two other things I often like to highlight to my students are the capacities for human persons who are steeped in healthy relationships to both tolerate ambiguity and ambivalence. So when we talk about ambiguity, we're talking about things like being okay with not knowing the answer to everything, being able to live in the what ifs and how comes and, not having clear answers. And then when it comes to ambivalence, emotionally thinking about living with a mixture of feelings, that I can feel both positive towards something and confused about it or upset about it or frustrated by it. I can love someone and be frustrated with them at the same time. These are just a few of the things that I think go into, at least my mind, when I'm thinking about what it means to be emotionally well. Again, always steeped in and situated in particularities of social location.
It's a great way of describing it. So if you were to imagine something of a topographical map of the mental health of America, what are some highs that you would say, yeah, those are examples of pretty thriving mental health experiences, and some of the predictable places where there's troughs and sometimes worse in our mental health. What would you say, with all due accounting, therefore, of the social location of how that is going to play out?
Right. Well, I think we're a culture that does believe in relationships. I think that we, kind of, if you get 20 different people in a room and say, do you think relationships are important? They're all going to say yes. As we dig down deeper, we might disagree with what that means or how that looks or what's foundational or fundamental to that. But I do think in the United States, there's a lot of agreement, at least behaviorally, maybe not intellectual, but that relationships are important. Why do we know that? I think one of the reasons we know it is, for example, that people refuse to stop getting together, even in a coronavirus saturated time. How they get together, we may disagree about the best way to do that, but people are determined to be with one another. And so we could flip that a number of ways, but I want to say there's probably something healthy about that, right? There's probably something that says we know that being with human beings in the flesh is important. Probably on the lower end of that, and the less than healthy, I would want to again point to our issues of the ways in which we have a hard time, again, dealing with ambivalence and ambiguity. We seem hell-bent on wanting to know what the answer is, and that there's a way to feel about it. And if you're not in my camp, then you're in another camp. And what I'm going to need to do is not just acknowledge you being in another camp, but I'm probably going to be pulled in some way to want to conquer and vanquish that other camp.
Which might include vanquishing you.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a couple places, I think, responding to highs and lows.
Right. Well, it is an amazing thing. And I recently had an opportunity to interview Broderick Leeks, who is, as you know, a graduate of Fuller's Psych School and who's the head of the Psych Center at USC. And we've zeroed in particular on the mental health needs of college students and graduate students and faculty and staff, all for their own intrinsic reasons, and then layered on to this particular moment in time and both the pandemic and the racial issues and the upset in higher education and the upset in the economy, et cetera. I want to get into those things in just a minute. But in that conversation, one of the things that really struck me was his sense about how mental health is in some profound way related to being with people and being able to articulate something that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily have opportunity to give speech to, but which the very opportunity to express is part of moving toward mental health. I don't know if you share that view, but if you do, how would you respond to that? I thought it was a very specific and practical kind of insight.
Can you elucidate that a little?
Well, I mean, for example, as a clinician, you know that it matters how people actually speak, that people come to speak to you about their lives, that they need to bring to speech, not just to their own cognitive acknowledgement, for example, but to articulate out loud to another person, both the joys, but also especially the challenges. And he was just emphasizing how providing a space for that regularly in a context like an intense competitive college atmosphere, for the unexpected, more problematic or complex, ambiguous or ambivalent speech to be able to be recognized and heard.
Right. No, yes, I would fully agree with that. I was working on something today and thinking again about how important it is for children or adults or whomever we're talking about to have spaces where they can process whatever it is they're going through. And it doesn't have to be traumatic, but if it is traumatic, even more so. We need people who will bear witness to our suffering and our pain. And to do it all alone by ourselves, once again, is for me not the height of emotional health or mental health or a way to emotionally regulate. We need other people to help us with that. And so whatever context, whatever space we're in, I couldn't agree more. We need the other who will, like as I said, bear witness, who will suffer along with us, who will demonstrate compassion. And I think that's one of the things that we offer in mental health, particularly in psychological services, whatever context that might be in, is we create space, hopefully, and I know it's a privileged space that not everyone has equal access to, unfortunately, but the more we can work on this to provide that space for a variety of people in a variety of cultures in the particular ways in which is most helpful, right? Not in a kind of, we know the way to do it. We try to teach our students here that we need to listen to the cultures and the context where we find people and morph ourselves into becoming the kinds of people who can listen in the way that people need to be listened to. Mm-hmm. But yes, that's a powerful antidote, if you will, to pain and suffering and fear and anxiety and depression, is to have a place to go. As one of my clients who suffers from severe mental illness says frequently, when you understand me, I feel better. And I have to keep being reminded of that by my patient.
Right. Now, it's probably worth pausing on just to acknowledge that some of the people who might be listening to this don't exist, of course, inside the fuller conversation where discussions about psychology are frequent and common and daily. So let's just pause on that for just a moment. You are a professor in the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy, and you are a professor of integration that tries to bring together the integration of theology, psychology, and intercultural studies. Mm-hmm. Now, that manifests itself in all kinds of ways. But when that school, when the School of Psychology, and now Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy began, it was a really extraordinary thing for an evangelical theological seminary to have a school of psychology. That was over 50 years ago. And it was thought then, sometimes still is, that faith and psychology, theology and psychology, are really enemies, and in that sense, competitors. So as we're going to turn this conversation into some specific areas where I want us to do some integration work, you might say. So explain what that even means and how it's legitimate that psychology and theology and intercultural studies can be, quote, integrated.
Right. No, great question. And as you note, there's been a long history of animosity between psychology and religion or spirituality, and particularly Christianity. But what a lot of people don't know is there's an equally long history of conversation between the two. You can go clear back to William James and the Variety of Religious Experience, 100 years old, right, at least, where psychologists at some of the biggest universities in the world were saying, well, now we know that religion and spirituality are central and important to what it means to be human. And so how can we bring that into conversation with this growing social science that we call psychology? And of course, psychology has its own history and its own journey. Is it a hard science? Is it a social science? What does all that mean? But for the most part, these days, I think it's fair to say that we don't have to engage in apologetics as much as we used to. We don't have to say, hey, it's okay that psychology and theology talk to one another. Now we're more interested in that conversation. What does it look like, and what are the elements of it? And
right.
it gets more into interdisciplinarity dialogue, I think, which you can have between physics and religion, or biology and religion, and what does that all look like? What I've become really interested in is who is the person of the integrator? And why does that really matter? And I think it will take us into some of the things we want to talk about later, maybe, about, how do I hold on to what I believe while I respect and acknowledge and welcome, whether it's a different discipline or whether it's a person from a different culture. How do we do that in healthy, integrated ways that allow us to bring the best of, all three? So culture, let's say, theology and psychology. How do we bring the best of that into a conversation where we can respect one another, where no one trumps the other, but that we're mutually impacted in profound ways? I think that's a psychologically challenging thing to do. And I think the healthier we are, the better we're going to do it.
I want to say, for those who may be less familiar with this kind of a conversation about how psychology, culture, and theology interact, that one of the things that Brad is responsible for every year at Fuller is something called the integration lectures. And you can find those on the Fuller website and Fuller Studio. They are remarkable, and they're examples of how we try to do some of this work. No one thinks that a lecture series equals integration, but it is provoked by the kind of lectures that have been given. And I just want to encourage everyone to take advantage of that if they would like to. So what I think is so interesting, and one of the reasons I think why Fuller is distinct in many ways is because of this three-school focus that involves these three disciplines of theology, psychology, and intercultural studies, and how those things are brought into partnership. And one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you as a guest is that we all know in our bodies, and we see every day in headlines and feeds in our social media and otherwise, that we are at a time where there's a great deal of emotional, psychological stress that is coming about because of external circumstances. But what it triggers is really some very deep stuff in us about how we think various aspects of our public life should go, and why we think and feel the way we do, and how we think we are able to hear or not hear one another, whether it's around issues of our response to the COVID crisis, whether it's around issues of race, or whether it's around economics and class differences. All these things are at play. And certainly the political campaign that is now in an advanced stage, in days before it actually will ultimately culminate in the day of the election. So I'd like us to just imagine sort of layering some of these things on. So we're in this era since 2016, which I think regardless of whether you consider yourself red or blue or purple or something else in between, I think everyone would say this period of time has been a time of a lot of national, personal, and interpersonal stress, division, hostility in various ways. So you arrived to that subject as the person you are, that's the embodiment of clinician, academic, and pastor. And you hold all those things very well because that's all part of what you naturally have to give yourself to. So give us some observations, and then I want you to give us a little more than that. So let's just start with some observations. How do you describe where we are?
Yeah. Well, if I could begin from a personal note, I think it's one of the things that is my deepest grief right now, honestly. And it's one of the things I was saying to someone the other day. It's the thing that I find myself having to trust the Lord the most about. It grieves me deeply that in the body of Christ we have such divisions. Not that we disagree, but really the way in which we do it. That leads to othering, that leads to name calling, that leads to questioning one another's ethics and morality and character. And it feels like, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that it feels at times quite hopeless, which, psychologists, we know that when you hear hopelessness, major depression is right around the corner, if not already there in the neighborhood. So this is the thing that grieves me, I think, the most deeply right now, as a psychologist, as a faculty member, and as a pastor in my own local congregation, is how at odds we are, or at war with one another that we are, how we try to conquer one another and vanquish one another and leave no survivors. That's kind of what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing, and it's the thing that brings me the most deep grief. It's the language of, and I've heard you say this as well, Mark, maybe there's been no other time in our culture where we will say about people on the other side, I can't even understand how they could think this way.
Right.
As a psychologist, as a clinical psychologist, my job is in fact to try and understand, even when it's so different from my own perspective. I've had some clients or patients. I tend to use the word patient because it I love the term, the one who suffers, and we're all patients in that sense. I've had some patients who are very much on the other side of the political spectrum, than I am. And somehow we know that it becomes sort of apparent over time. And they rib me and they tease me and they insult me. I hope that I don't do that to them. But in the middle of that, I keep remembering that it's my job to try to deeply understand where they're coming from. Not necessarily what they believe, but why it is that they believe what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it always comes back to feelings that we're carrying around that are part of our histories as well as part of our present, part of our social locations, part of our race and our culture and our gender and all these kinds of things, which is why I love psychology, because it's just so complex and so fascinating. I'm never, ever bored
Right.
when it comes
Absolutely.
to my job.
Yes.
But to constantly trying to be putting that in conversation with theological assumptions and, religious and spiritual beliefs or values, and, trying to do that makes it, again, such a complicated and rich situation that's prone to emotional dysregulation and blowing up, which leads to anger and hostility, and even, as we know, violence in our culture. So I'm really interested in, this article that I have coming out in the Fuller magazine. I don't know what the final title is, but the one I suggested is, "Why am I so mad all the time?" or "Why are we so mad all the time?" And people are just mad. And I don't think they know exactly why. But I think it's because in these very complicated conversations, we feel like something about who I am has been attacked and is being deconstructed. And it makes sense to me that if someone feels as if who they are and what they believe and what they put all their sort of value in is suddenly being upended, it's being questioned, it's a very natural survival mechanism to attack back. It's very hard to hold on to ourselves and say, well, let's have a nice conversation about this. I feel attacked, and so I want to attack back.
I wrote a little article for this same issue of Fuller magazine about how manners have to be given up, in one sense, as a threshold for this moment, because if they are a regulator that is keeping us from having real self-examining conversations and understanding not necessarily our own rage, but the rage of other people, then we're not really actually helped by that. And we can't just call them into mannerliness. We have to understand that our calling, I would argue, as a Christian, is to try to step into the spaces where other people have their rage and their anger and their distress, right, and to listen as carefully and as well as we can. Mm-hmm. But that often then steps on all kinds of things. And manners, of course, is an elaborate system of self-regulation. This is how you should behave in certain settings. Right. And it will go better for everyone until there's the makings of it, of what is at least argued to be genuine, full-on crisis, in which case then manners seem at least up for grabs when you're trying to argue for something like survival. So I guess what I'm wondering is, Brad, what would you say are some of the triggers that brought us from being a nation that already had a lot of anger and a lot of issues and differences of opinion and tribalisms and so forth to this moment? What are I'm not really here suggesting a political response to that. I'm asking more in the sense of what has happened in the culture that has changed the way that we have these conversations, as you've, I think, aptly described so much.
Well, I think, again, it kind of goes back to who am I? What is important to me? What do I value? And when someone comes on the scene who says, I don't value that, we become enraged. So, for example, I think women's issues is one to speak about and talk about, right? I think a lot of clinicians were, and probably a lot of pastors, were smacked in the face after the 2016 election when women were weeping in our offices, saying this no longer feels like a safe country for me to be a part of. Of course, we could talk equally around culture and race, right? Or sexual orientation. And people in our offices saying, I don't know if I can literally live here anymore or feel safe here anymore, because not only what I believe or what I think, but who I am now feels at risk. It's no longer safe to be a woman of color, or to be a woman of color from a different sexual orientation, right? These things that seem so central and part of what we describe as our identity are suddenly in question, or suddenly we've seen that it's no longer safe to be those things. I think that has taken us to another level as a culture here in the United States, where other countries are sort of, I think, kind of scratching their heads at times and saying, we have our issues for sure, but not quite the same way you all do.
Right. It is a very interesting, and I'm sure will be a long studied question of why America has been processing this season in the way that it's being processed. That will be that'll take some time to be able to look back and see more clearly than we can right at the moment.
Right. And I think, again, COVID, the coronavirus, I think we're far from understanding the psychological implications of that. The sense of loss, the sense of anxiety, the sense of fear that hits some people, but then other people don't seem to have any fear about it at all, right? And so again, we're back at this, how do I understand you? I'm full of fear about this, and you are having parties with no masks. How in the world can I understand you? And I think, where I go in the article is this idea that it has to do with this idea of differentiation of self and other, and differentiation of affect and cognition. In other words, can I keep thinking when I'm feeling? And can I keep feeling when I'm thinking? And can I balance what it means to be intimate with someone where I don't have to fear engulfment, like I have to become you, but I also don't have to fear being cast aside, abandoned. And I think, there's some developmentalists in psychology who say that this task of separateness and connectedness is an ongoing task throughout the lifespan of what it means to be human. And we're all at different spaces in it. We're all at different places. It is developmental. Some of us get stuck maybe and keep going around the same merry-go-round, where others move in different ways that can be life-giving, but it can also be threatening to other people. It's just really, really complex. And I think that we need to try to not avoid the complexity of this at the same time where we try to find some ways in which we can actually talk to each other, whatever it is we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And that reintroduces the possibility of manners, because in a way, once you've gotten to that point, then you can order your conversation differently. If you try to forestall that by cutting it off and saying, we're not going to actually have that conversation, you're just wrong and I'm right, then you're not getting the real stuff on the table. And then you can't come to any kind of real conversation.
Right.
So there is a venting that's necessary.
Yes.
And there's also a capacity to be able to vent and then move through your venting to be able to engage in a different
in the clinical setting, when working with someone, say, who's experienced trauma, one of the things we recognize, or at least certain clinicians will recognize, is that we not only enter with the suffering, but oftentimes we become the source of the one who's causing the pain. And so we have to be able to sit with that and let my client, metaphorically bang their fists against my chest and say, why have you caused this pain in my life? Why have you hurt me in such a way? Even though we know at some level, right, I'm not the original one who's caused the pain. Right. I think that's a big part when it comes right now around issues of race and white fragility. Yes. Can white people just sit and take it and be okay with that and not let ourselves be filled with shame to the point where we have to fight back against that? Right. But just to enter into the pain and suffering and say, yep. I'm part of this, and you have every right to be angry with me. And I believe and trust the process that we can come out on the other side together.
But what that assumes is a capacity for appropriate levels of control. This is back to the self-regulation piece,
Yes.
right? So when it feels, let's say, for those who wander around feeling nothing but vulnerable and have lost all sense of control in this pandemic, for example, or in this political moment, or in this economic moment, then it's understandable that it just causes pure emotional confusion and vulnerability and acute sense of loss and so forth. Then you have other people, stereotypically, who seem to have no problem with control and are, in fact, ready to make the most of every exercise of self-control for their own self-interest, at least, as they want to exercise. And anything that would threaten their sense of control is the problem, not the underlying social condition, medical condition, whatever it might be. Do you want to comment on that, just that issue of control and how it plays?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as you're mentioning, I mean, there's ways in which, people, I see them take psychological concepts that are good and healthy and useful, but turn them to their own, selfish ends in such a way. I think there's a kind of out of controlness that we have to be okay with, actually.
Yes, right.
That's the task all the time in psychotherapy. And I think it's probably the task in good pastoral care and counseling. I do a fair share of preaching. You do a lot of preaching. You think about preaching, write about preaching. And I'm aware how oftentimes in the preaching moment, even I feel somewhat out of control. And that's okay, because we hopefully are trusting that there's one who is overseeing all of this, the Spirit, who is imminently at work, right, in these very moments, and can bring repair out of rupture. That's one of my favorite terms that we use in psychotherapy these days, is rupture and repair. That we know there's constantly going to be rupture. It's part of the work. But as we get wiser, we know that we can repair. I tell my students all the time, I used to be afraid all the time of making mistakes as a clinician. Now I just know I'm going to make them. I just know I'm better at repairing when I make those mistakes. I'm better at going back and saying, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I messed up. I missed you. I didn't hear you. I didn't understand you, probably because of who I am. But I want to come back now, hearing that you've been hurt by what I've done or said, and try to repair that, move to deeper layers of understanding with you than I had before. So it's not so much like a manners that we all agree to, right?
Yes,
but it's a kind of process of which I enter into relationships saying, I know I'm going to screw this up.
Right.
I know I'm going to make mistakes, but I want to be the kind of person that's open to it. Our chief of diversity, inclusion, and equity here, Alexis Abernathy, some of the things she's given us have been so helpful to come into a classroom and say, hey, guess what? I know I'm going to mess up. I'm going to try my hardest, but I'm going to mess up. And if I do, or not if, but really when I do, I'd like to invite any of you in groups of ones or twos or threes or 20s to come to me and say, Dr. Strawn, you got it really wrong. You said something that hurt. And my commitment or my covenant with you as your professor is to hear that in as non-defensive a way as I can, and to enter back into relationship with you, repair again, and say, how can we move forward from this moment in place where hopefully we're all learning something. It may be that this time I'm doing the most learning, but I think there's a relationship that can develop from it.
This conversation could go on and on because it's so rich and because the things that we're talking about are so complex and so personal and profound to us. We're listening to this perhaps just on the cusp of America's national election in 2020. It's a day that will influence everything that we've just been talking about. Whatever the outcome, for some people, it will be one kind of response. For others, it will be another kind of response. There'll be others that'll have, a more mixed response. But in any case, I guess I just want us to close perhaps with some reflections that you might want to offer up about how should people prepare themselves for this day? And then how should they think about it? What should they be doing in, let's say, the first week or the first 2 weeks after the election, just to take advantage of the insights of integration that you're offering us?
Yeah. again, I want to acknowledge right away that all I'm thinking about comes from a particular place of white privilege, right?
Right.
And I fear that some of my brothers and sisters on either side will panic and think the end of the world has come. And I'd like to say the end of the world probably hasn't come, and yet I say that as a white male. But what I want to say is that as a community of believers, as people committed to mental health and Christian ethics, character and morality, that I want to keep holding hope that we can come together and that we can find places of commonality. We can find places where we can recognize there's some really bad stuff and there's some really good stuff. And we have to be able to regulate ourselves in it. I really do think that we have to be responsible for our emotional regulation. We have to be able to say, I've got to hold on to myself in the middle of this, in community though. So I'm holding on to myself while I'm being held by a bunch of other people, and that I get to be someone who helps hold other people as well. I felt that so profoundly, not only as a clinician, but as a pastor in my own congregation, even in these days, beginning to lead up to the election, where, you know, especially on social media, we're wounding each other and we're doing all the stuff that we know we do. But is there some way in which we can recognize that no matter what kingdom or empire is in power at the moment, we serve another empire. We serve another kingdom. We're a part of something else, the kingdom of God or the reign of God, however you like to talk about that. And that can bring us hope and that can bring us confidence. And as we gather around that, even in our differences, there's something common there. And I think the commonality is love. I think it's this cycle of love. In my church, we've been studying 1 John, and there is this cycle of love, right? Love God, obey God's command, love one another. And by the way, God's command is to love one another. So there's an essentialness to this. There's a firstness. There's a centrality to this issue of love, which is, again, I think found in Philippians, where we empty ourselves for the sake of the other, whoever that other might be. It might be sometimes the conservative emptying themselves for the liberal, but it might be sometimes the liberal, the progressive, emptying themselves for the sake of their brother or sister who's more conservative than they are. It's just hard work. And I hope we can keep doing it in community with one another.
So, Brad, one of the things that I'm hearing in your words so far is that underneath all of these raging issues of debate, there's actually an underlying seedbed of emotion that arises and functions with great power and strength inside our lives. And that perhaps the issue is less about the issues only and much more about the underlying emotion. Just say a bit more about that.
Right, sure. I don't want it to negate or downplay anyone's particular, connection to an issue or concept. But I do think that what really fuels it is that there's some sort of feeling underneath. There's a feeling state. And often those feelings are related to anxiety or fear, sometimes, deep worry that we might call depression. And that when we communicate with one another, if we can communicate at that level, if we can say to one another, it seems like you have some real concerns about this. You have some anxiety. You have some fear about it. That's what gets us back to empathizing with one another and takes our communication out of the realm of sort of the esoteric and ideological and brings it down to where real human persons communicate. And so I think it's so important for us to recognize both in ourselves, that's key, right? That we're feeling something, but to also recognize who we're communicating with is also feeling something very deeply. And again, that's how we get back to empathy.
Well, I think one of the things that's the most moving always to me about Jesus' teaching is in what we call the Sermon on the Mount, when he just tells us that we need to not only love those who love us, but we need to love those who are our enemies. And,
Amen.
well, we may or may not necessarily, we may think of people who hold a different political view as our enemies, but we may, in any case, feel like they are a problem to us. We don't know what to do with them. That feeling that you described earlier of, I just don't even understand how a person could possibly hold their view, whatever that view might be.
Yeah.
And I do think, quite literally in these weeks leading up to the election, which will be shortened by the time this is released, but there's I think an amazing sense of just realizing this honestly takes practice. We actually can't expect to just come out of the gate and practice it. We're being given an unusual set of opportunities every day to learn to practice it, because whatever we know the election is going to do, it's not going to resolve this crisis. It will change certain people who are in power or not, but it will not resolve the process.
Right.
And the actual work has to continue to go on. And this is partly why I feel like the insights that you're helping get stimulated and focused on at Fuller in various ways as the professor of integration is exactly what we need for intrinsic Christian reasons, pastoral reasons, ministry-related reasons, but also for public citizenship reasons, for neighborliness reasons, for life and faith in the public square kind of reasons. And I'm just so thankful, Brad, for what you're doing and for the gifts that you've given us today and explaining things that I think for some people might be quite new. I, again, want to just point you to the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy that Fuller has. And if you want to follow up, you can find more resources there from and about Brad. The Fuller magazine, if you're on that list, will be forthcoming. And we're just very, very thankful, Brad, for the way that you are stimulating this today in this conversation and helping to lift up some of the reasons why this work is so hard and so necessary.
Thanks.
So thank you again very much.
For sure. Yeah.